till they get it up. Y'all gon' make me lose my mind. Up in here, up in here. Y'all gon' make me go all out. Up in here, up in here. Y'all gon' make me act a fool. Up in here, up in here. Y'all gon' make me lose my cool. Up in here, up in here.
With World Championship Wrestling becoming the most watched wrestling show in the United States during 1997, the WWF would find itself in need of a little boost. The New World Order storyline was grabbing all the headlines, and Eric Bischoff's strategy to expand his viewing audience was working extremely well. The WWF would try new things in 1997 to try and steal some of those headlines. The company had failed previously when it came to creating legitimate buzz because they always played it safe. But Vince McMahon looked at another wrestling company who had an incredible underground following that could possibly cross over and help the WWF grab some much needed attention. It was really a two-way street. ECW was in need of some buzz too, especially on a national scale, because they were going to go on pay-per-view soon. So while in comparison ECW and WWF were very, very different, this odd coupling of the extreme and the relatively safe really benefited both organisations. The WWF had to do something to get people talking, and ECW wanted to show that they too could entertain fans on a prime-time wrestling show. Today's video will look at the ECW Invasion that took place in 1997. Paul Heyman said that there was no bigger supporter of ECW than Vince McMahon. The more shots Paulie would take during ECW shows, the more Vince McMahon loved it. Heyman thinks that McMahon had a good relationship with ECW because Vince thought the Land of Extreme was actually good for the entire business of wrestling. It was a place where new stars could get created and eventually transition into the, quote, big leagues of pro wrestling, even though many ECW stars would also jump to WCW. It must have been quite a shock to the hardcore ECW fanbase when they learned years and years later that Paul Heyman would have long phone conversations with Vince McMahon on multiple occasions, the ringleader of the Extreme seemingly doing business with the same man who was portrayed as the enemy. One of ECW's biggest competitors was also one of their greatest allies. Jim Ross said, "Vince and Paul had a great relationship. We were helping them because we looked at it as, well, maybe at some point in time we'll get access to some of their stars. Certainly not to rob ECW of their talent, but here and there we could pick out somebody who could come in and help us." It's been said that Vince McMahon began paying attention to ECW after the 1995 King of the Ring. The pay-per-view was held in Philadelphia, ECW's home turf, and during the King of the Ring finals, the audience chanted EC Dub as they watched Mabel win the tournament. It's never been confirmed when Heyman and McMahon really began talking about beginning a talent exchange agreement, but the summer of 1996 would be a good guess, seeing as Paul Heyman, Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman all showed up at the WWF's In Your House Mind Games pay-per-view in September of 96, also held in Philadelphia. During the opening match between Savio Vega and Justin Hawk Bradshaw, the Sandman spat beer over Vega, and Vince McMahon acknowledged Sandman and Dreamer by saying the two men were from a local wrestling group before the ECW wrestlers were escorted out of the building. This was all done in a way that made it look like these guys had shown up without invitation and this wasn't supposed to happen, and this in turn would create buzz for ECW. Vince McMahon talked about this working agreement on the Rise and Fall of ECW DVD, and he said that he thought the partnership between ECW and the WWF would be good for the business, while also saying he would not do the same for WCW. Vince recognised that ECW didn't have the same distribution promotion as WCW or the WWF for that matter, and so Vince gave the thumbs up for some co-promotion so things like Mind Games here could happen, and of course Vince was also eyeballing ECW talent that he could showcase on WWF TV shows. The WWF was in desperate need of a shake-up in 1997 though. WCW were destroying them in the ratings, and bringing in ECW, a promotion that was getting a lot of attention from die-hard fans, was a smart move. The WWF, quite simply, needed to move away from that stuff they were doing in the mid-90s. Tommy Dreamer said, "They needed a boost and we definitely needed a boost. WWE was getting their butt kicked by WCW and they needed something that said you have to tune into Monday Night Raw because anything could happen." Following Mind Games, the talent exchanges would begin and both companies traded superstars over the course of around 2 years. Guys who would see themselves in ECW while still having WWF contracts included Justin Credible, Brappas, Al Snow, Darren Drozdov and Chris Candido, just to name a few. The WWF, however, benefited almost immediately from the talent exchanges by bringing in ECW guys following Mind Games. Wrestlers from ECW who began working in the WWF in 1996 included Doug Furnas and Phil LaFawn, Terry Gordy, who would portray the Executioner, and Too Cold Scorpio, who would work in the World Wrestling Federation as Flash Funk. Speaking of Too Cold Scorpio, it was a sponsorship for Scorpio's ECW theme music that caused a lot of confusion and a lot of allegations to be thrown at Paul Heyman. A big sticking point for a lot of ECW diehards is that Paul Heyman was on WWF Payroll, and Paul Heyman was accepting WWF money while preaching to his audience that the World Wrestling Federation were the enemy. Heyman, to this day, denies that he ever received any kind of payments from the World Wrestling Federation except $1,000 per week in lieu of sponsorship money that ECW received for playing Scorpio's theme music. Tommy Boy Records paid ECW $1,000 per week to show a lower third or a full screen thank you message, and ECW were also allowed to use Scorpio's theme song, so it was a pretty good deal ECW was getting here. If Scorpio jumps over to the WWF, then ECW would lose that sponsorship. Paul Heyman said that Vince McMahon paid $1,000 per week when ECW lost the sponsorship. Vince McMahon wanted to give ECW the money they'd be losing out on if Too Cold Scorpio was coming to work for the World Wrestling Federation. Heyman says that money went to production costs, ad campaigns, salaries, whatever it was needed for. The money did not go into Paul Heyman's pocket, and the only records that can ever be found of WWF paying ECW was that $1,000 per week. Completely up to you if you believe it, but it's the only time it's ever been officially addressed. The night after Mind Games, the WWF stayed in Philadelphia for Monday Night Raw. During a tag team match pitting Davey Boy Smith and Owen Hart against the Body Donnas, ECW's Taz jumped the guardrail and he held up a sign that said, "Sabu fears Taz." Taz was acknowledged by Jim Ross on commentary, saying that this is another local guy trying to get his 15 minutes of fame. Taz also spoke about this in the Rise and Fall of ECW documentary, saying that a WWF photographer tried to stop him from jumping the guardrail, and Taz ended up pushing the guy out of the way and breaking his shoulder. There were no other incidents in 1996 once the WWF left Philadelphia. Guys from the talent exchange would begin showing up in the WWF, some of which were repackaged, and things stayed relatively quiet on the WWF side while ECW continued to make headlines while doing their own thing. In 1997 though, things would completely explode when Jerry the King Lawler became very vocal about the buzz that ECW was generating. On the 17th of February episode of Raw, the King grabbed an ECW sign from a fan and he said nobody even knows what ECW is, going on to explain to fans that ECW is filled with misfits and has-beens who couldn't make it in the World Wrestling Federation. Lawler says he's sick of seeing ECW signs in WWF audiences, and he challenges anyone from ECW to show up on Monday Night Raw the following week in the Manhattan Center. A little later on, Paul Heyman called into the show, and Paul Heyman says that he and a group of ECW superstars will be showing up next week on Raw. The challenge had been accepted. Jerry Lawler would play a key role throughout this whole storyline, and there actually was some legitimate heat between Lawler and Heyman, but it had nothing to do with this invasion. It went all the way back to Memphis in the 80s when Heyman apparently refused to take a bump during a scaffold match, apparently. The following episode of Raw, the 24th of February 1997 episode, is one of the most infamous Raw broadcasts of 1997 and possibly of all time. ECW took over the show while wrestlers from the promotion were given the opportunity to showcase their abilities on primetime TV. It's been said that the whole ECW roster showed up to the Manhattan Center in matching ECW tracksuits, showing a form of unity backstage to the WWF locker room, and this was something that impressed Vince McMahon. This episode of Raw is really worth watching though from start to end, as it really does highlight the differences between ECW and the World Wrestling Federation. Segments were dedicated to each promotion, with ECW giving fans their version of in-ring action, while the WWF gave us an arm wrestling contest between Sonny and Marlena, and they also aired an updated version of the Shawn Michaels Tell Me a Lie music video. After the opening contest pitting the new Blackjacks against the Godwins, Paul Heyman storms the ring along with the Eliminators. A quote ring attendant gets nailed with the total elimination. Paul Heyman announces that the challenge has been accepted, ECW is in the house, and the New York audience chants EC-dub as Raw goes to commercial break. We come back and Paul Heyman announces that we're going to see an ECW match happen live on Raw, the first of a few, and we're going to get the full-blooded Italians Little Guido taking on Big Stevie Cool from the BWO. The Blue World Order hit the ring and Stevie says that ECW and the BWO are taking over, something that gives Vince McMahon a chuckle while Jerry Lawler looks on in disgust. Paul Heyman goes on commentary for the match, and Paul Heyman calls the BWO a revolutionary group within professional wrestling. Jerry Lawler calls them a rip-off faction, and Vince McMahon flat out mentions the NWO by bringing up the similar logos on their t-shirts. ECW heavyweight champion Raven stands on the entranceway and he taunts Stevie Richards. Paul Heyman says here that he respects Vince McMahon, and if this WWF thing doesn't work out, he can have a job in ECW calling matches. Jerry Lawler says he's seen ECW television previously and the company is in desperate need of a good commentator. Goldust is then shown and Vince wants to know what he thinks of this whole ECW invasion, and Goldust gives a non-answer. Goldust just says that he's the premier while everyone else are just B-movies. The match ends with Big Stevie Cool hitting the Stevie kick, and Stevie Richards takes a little time to talk trash to Jerry Lawler after the bout. Normal WWF service resumes afterwards with the aforementioned arm wrestling contest between Sonny and Marlena, along with a match pitting Goldust against Savio Vega. WWF newcomer Ken Shamrock then gets interviewed by Jerry Lawler while the crowd chants "We want Taz." Paul Heyman then says that WWF Raw has sucked before ECW decided to show up, and Paul then introduces the next match, an ECW bout featuring Mikey Whipwreck taking on Taz. Fans will remember this one thanks to Sabu kinda jumping and kinda falling off the Raw entranceway when trying to attack Team Taz. It sure did get a lot of people talking. Taz wins the match with a Tazplex followed by the Taz Mission. Afterwards, the World Wrestling Federation had a surprise of their own, the return of the Legion of Doom. Hawk and Animal came back to the WWF here in a match against the Headbangers, so yeah, a lot of good stuff happening here on this show. The mood is then brought way down with that Shawn Michaels music video. This was around the time Shawn forfeited the title, and I'm sure this gave the hardcore ECW audience a good laugh. Another ECW match follows, Devon Dudley versus the innovator of violence, Tommy Dreamer, and Heyman takes the time to plug the upcoming Barely Legal pay-per-view while introducing Tommy Dreamer. Barely Legal would be ECW's very first pay-per-view event. During this match, Jerry Lawler says that Paul Heyman should be kissing the King's feet for allowing him to plug an ECW pay-per-view on WWF television. Nobody would have known it was even on TV if it wasn't for this opportunity, and Paul Heyman says he'll give thanks to Vince McMahon but not Jerry Lawler. Lawler buries the match and tensions rise at the announce table. Lawler says he's never in his life been embarrassed to be involved in professional wrestling, but tonight he's embarrassed to have any kind of association with extremely crappy wrestling. Dreamer wins the match, Bubba Ray comes down to hit a 3D on Tommy, and then the Sandman enters the arena for the save. Vicious chair shots from Sandman end the segment, and Paul Heyman takes the time to thank Vince McMahon for allowing ECW to come on to WWF Raw, and Barely Legal again gets plugged. Lawler doesn't want to hear it. Jerry pushes Heyman and Paul comes right back at the King. Vince McMahon and ECW superstars try to break up the fight as Raw goes to a commercial break. And that was it. That was the ECW Invasion episode of Monday Night Raw. The show closed out with Farouk battling The Undertaker. Paul Heyman and ECW came back to the WWF on the March 10th, 1997 episode of Raw for an extreme debate. ECW was represented by Paul Heyman while Jerry Lawler represented the World Wrestling Federation. Earlier in the evening, Taz confronted Jerry Lawler and Sabu put himself through a table. We weren't sure if Sabu was going for Taz or Lawler, but what's noteworthy here is that Lawler made a joke about Taz's size afterwards, saying the human suplex machine looked bigger on the Lucky Charms box. This comment apparently really offended Taz, and the King and Taz would have a little heat afterwards. The whole point of this debate segment was to again promote the Barely Legal pay-per-view, but it didn't take long for Heyman and Lawler to start throwing jabs at each other. The King said that everyone in ECW realised they couldn't have proper matches, and so they had to resort to beating each other up with weapons. ECW puts on garbage shows in bingo halls in front of 1,100 fans, and when the WWF shows up to Philadelphia, they draw 20,000 fans to big arenas. Heyman talks about how ECW superstars bust their asses for wrestling fans, while the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer show up. The King says Heyman wants to be thankful that he can plug a pay-per-view on WWF television, and the King will never understand why Vince McMahon allows it. Things then get personal when Heyman says that Lawler's kids won't use the King's surname because they're so embarrassed, and the King says that Heyman is a 35-year-old man who still lives in his mother's basement. Things then get really heated when Tommy Dreamer challenges Lawler to a fight. ECW superstars surround the King, and when the King asks for help from the WWF roster, no one comes down. The segment ends with Lawler screaming at Heyman that these ECW guys may be able to cause some damage, but Paul Heyman himself is absolutely nothing. Barely Legal went ahead, and the pay-per-view was supposed to feature a match between Chris Candido and Lance Storm. Rob Van Dam replaced Candido, and RVD told the world afterwards that it's a travesty that he wasn't included on the pay-per-view in the first place. Van Dam ripped into the ECW fans and Paul Heyman, saying that he only agreed to do this match because it would make him more valuable in the eyes of different promotions. RVD was a guy Vince McMahon wanted to showcase on WWF television, and so what RVD was doing here was planting the seeds for his inevitable WWF Raw debut. Van Dam showed up on the May 12th episode of Raw, and Jerry Lawler said that RVD was also sick and tired of ECW. Van Dam said that ECW failed to hold on to his extreme talents before Lawler gave Rob the name of Mr. Monday Night, and RVD then had a match with Jeff Hardy, a match that left WWF fans wanting more thanks to how good Van Dam truly was. The RVD and Jerry Lawler partnership would also begin playing out on ECW television when Jerry Lawler made a surprise appearance at the WrestlePalooza show. Raven was getting ready to leave Extreme Championship Wrestling for WCW, and so a loser leaves town match was booked between Raven and Tommy Dreamer. Dreamer wins the match, and then the lights go out in the arena. They come back on, and RVD, wearing a Monday Night Raw shirt, attacks Dreamer. When Dreamer begins getting the upper hand, Sabu shows up, and again, when Tommy Dreamer looks like he's taking care of business, the lights go out one more time, they come back on, and Jerry Lawler is standing in an ECW ring. Sabu, Lawler and RVD, along with help from Louis Spicolli, absolutely destroy every ECW superstar who tries to enter the ring. It's absolute decimation and the fans go crazy. But when Taz shows up, the four men get out of the ring. Van Dam would have two further matches in the WWF during 1997. He wrestled Too Cold Scorpio, or Flash Funk, on the June 9th episode of Monday Night Raw, and he also teamed up with Jerry Lawler the following week to take on the Headbangers. When RVD came down to the ring for his singles match with Scorpio, Tommy Dreamer and Paul Heyman were seen in the audience, and officials had to stop them from jumping the guardrail. After RVD won the match, Heyman and Lawler began fighting, leading to Tommy Dreamer and Van Dam also getting involved. On the 16th of June episode of Raw, the same night as the tag team match featuring Lawler and RVD teaming up, an ECW versus USWA bout took place inside a WWF ring when ECW's Chris Candido battled the USWA's Brian Christopher. The match ended when Jerry Lawler came down to attack Candido, and this resulted in Tommy Dreamer running down for the save. In the tag team match a little later on, the Sandman got involved, effectively costing Lawler and RVD the match. RVD then tried to attack the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer in the audience, but it was broke up by officials. The following week, Sabu had a match against Flash Funk with Paul Heyman on commentary. We'll come back to this night a little later. Over on ECW programming, Lawler would continue to make surprise appearances, leading to a 3-on-3 tag team steel cage match at Heatwave 97 featuring Lawler, Sabu and RVD taking on Rick Rude, the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer. Rick Rude backstabbed his tag team partner, and this one turned into a 30-minute beatdown until Taz showed up. RVD, Sabu and Fonzie escape the cage while Lawler is left in there all alone. Lawler takes the Taz mission, but he's eventually saved by Shane Douglas, Bam Bam Bigelow and Chris Candido, the triple threat. At Hardcore Heaven the following month, Jerry Lawler lost to Tommy Dreamer in a match that also saw interference from Jake Roberts and Sonny. Strange run-ins aside, you should give this one a watch. It's a pretty good matchup and it's also quite violent. It's been reported that the ECW and WWF relationship got a little strained back at the 23rd of June Raw tapings, the one where Sabu wrestled Flash Funk. Apparently, Sabu complained about his match finish, and RVD refused to lose to the Road Dogg Jesse James, comparing this loss to Bret Hart showing up in Philadelphia and putting over one of ECW's lower card wrestlers. It's been said also that SummerSlam 1997 was supposed to feature a Jerry Lawler and Rob Van Dam versus Tommy Dreamer and Sandman match, and judging by what was going on Monday Night Raw, that match certainly looked like it was going to happen, but things didn't work out, and instead Lawler went to ECW to have those matches I just spoke about. ECW and the World Wrestling Federation would continue to exchange talent, but the on-screen relationship pretty much ended, and that was the end of the ECW invasion of the World Wrestling Federation. ECW would eventually become a big part of the WCW invasion way down the road, and we'd get to see the likes of RVD, Sabu, Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman once again on WWF programming, but I've already covered this. You can check it out by clicking on the link on the screen. All in all, the 1997 ECW Invasion was really a fascinating time period, and it does go to show that the World Wrestling Federation were once very willing to work with other promotions. You also had Lawler's USWA in the mix, and at the start of 1997, the WWF also had a ton of AAA superstars showing up to compete in the Royal Rumble. Because of how things are nowadays, it's hard to imagine this kind of thing happening again within the WWF, but never say never. If it's something that benefits both organisations and it benefits us as fans, then there's no reason why we couldn't see more crossovers in the future. Just don't be holding your breath for the time being. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching and take care.